What if I told you that one economic shock could cause countries to collapse? Not from war, not from a virus, but from a US recession. It sounds unbelievable, right? But it's happening. The US economy doesn't just influence the world, it holds it up. So, what happens when that pillar cracks? Let's explore the nations hanging by a thread. Number 1. Lebanon, the ticking time bomb. A country once known for its banking secrecy and Mediterranean charm. Now, it's gasping for breath. Here's the shocking truth. Lebanon has already collapsed, and the US recession might just be the final blow. Banks have frozen withdrawals. The Lebanese pound? It's lost over 90% of its value. And right now, millions rely on US remittances to survive. But if the US enters recession, those remittances dry up. Hospitals can't import supplies. Students can't afford tuition. Supermarkets can't even stock basics. Imagine the horror if the US sneezes and Lebanon falls. Number 2. Pakistan, a fragile giant. With over 240 million people and nuclear capabilities, it seems like an unstoppable force. But here's the kicker. Pakistan's economy is walking a financial tightrope. Foreign reserves? Barely enough to cover 6 weeks of imports. Its debt? A terrifying 130 billion US dollars. And what happens when US remittances and trade vanish? Fuel shortages, blackouts, skyrocketing food prices. The economy could crash, and the worst part, Pakistan won't see it coming. Number 3. Argentina, the domino effect. What if I told you Argentina could default? Again? This nation, rich in farmland and culture, has defaulted on debt 9 times. Yes, 9. Right now, Argentina owes the International Monetary Fund over 45 billion US dollars, and their economy is barely holding together. But here's the twist. Argentina depends heavily on US trade and investment. If the US economy stumbles, those lifelines vanish. Soybeans, lithium, their few exports, they lose value. Inflation? It's already above 200%. And soon, millions could be pushed back into poverty. The US recession might just finish Argentina off. Number 4. Egypt, a country on the brink. A nation of over 110 million people, standing on the edge. You might not know this, but Egypt's economy is tied to 3 critical factors: tourism, foreign investment, and the Suez Canal. If the US enters recession, all 3 could vanish. And Egypt's debt? Over 165 billion US dollars, with $42 billion in payments due next year. The country is already struggling with inflation. What happens if tourists cancel their flights, investors pull out, and the shipping lanes empty? Cairo could collapse, and fast. Are you ready for the chaos to unfold? Number 5. Ghana, the ticking debt time bomb. Ghana was once seen as one of Africa's rising stars. But here's the cold truth. Ghana is drowning in debt. In 2022, Ghana became the first African country to default on its debt since the pandemic. The currency? It lost 50% of its value in a single year. Inflation soared above 54%. And here's where it gets dangerous: US remittances. In 2024 alone, over $4 billion in remittances flowed in. But if the US enters recession and those dollars dry up, food prices explode, jobs vanish, and Ghana could face national instability. Are they strong enough to survive? Number 6. Zambia, the copper curse. A country dependent on copper exports, struggling with crippling debt and facing a potential recession. This is Zambia. Zambia's copper mines make up over 70% of its export revenue. But when copper prices drop, the economy falters, and Zambia is $13 billion in debt. Worse still, Zambia defaulted in 2020 and is still struggling to recover. If a US recession triggers a global capital flight, Zambia could fall into economic darkness. But it gets worse. Half the population lives in poverty. And when foreign aid and investments vanish, everything comes to a screeching halt. Zambia's time might be running out. Number 7. Sri Lanka, the collapse in motion. Do you remember what happened in Sri Lanka in 2022? It was a wake-up call. Supermarket shelves were empty. People lined up just for cooking gas. Protesters stormed the presidential palace. And here's the terrifying part. Sri Lanka isn't out of the woods yet. The country defaulted on its debt for the first time in history. Foreign currency reserves? Nearly gone. Power cuts lasting hours. Food inflation at 90%. And now, a US recession could throw Sri Lanka back into freefall. Tourism, remittances, and investment, they all depend on global stability. What happens if that disappears? Number 8. Ecuador, a powder keg. In Ecuador, things are already unraveling. Bodies of water drying up. Power cuts rolling through cities. And here's the truth. It's not war. It's a country trapped in an economic nightmare. Ecuador uses the US dollar as its currency. But when the US sneezes, Ecuador catches pneumonia. The oil that fuels its economy? It loses value the moment global demand slows. And with a rising violence crisis and government instability, Ecuador is on the brink. A US recession could bring a complete collapse. Can Ecuador hold it together? Number 9. Tunisia, a fragile hope. Tunisia is suffocating. Bread lines growing longer. Pharmacies empty. And tourism, the nation's economic backbone, is vanishing. With a 40% government budget going toward wages and subsidies, Tunisia is borrowing heavily to stay afloat. But a US recession could trigger mass instability. Inflation is already eating away at purchasing power. Food prices are skyrocketing. And Tunisia's fragile political system can't handle much more. One global shock could send the nation over the edge. Will it be the end of Tunisia's middle-class dream? Number 10. Jordan, the ultimate precarious state. And finally, Jordan, a country that imports 90% of its energy, yet has no oil of its own. Jordan is held up by foreign aid, loans, and fragile alliances. But here's the brutal reality. If US financial aid dries up, Jordan could collapse. With youth unemployment nearing 50% and food prices climbing, any shock to Jordan's economy could send it spiraling. A US recession would dry up remittances and tourism, and the country would be left vulnerable. One small shock could be enough to break it all. How long can Jordan survive? Conclusion. The truth is, these countries are hanging by a thread. One global shock could unravel everything. If you found this eye-opening, don't forget to hit subscribe so we can continue bringing you the untold stories of the world's most fragile economies. Share this with others, because the more we know, the more we can prepare.